Skaven Clans mod brings a massive number of new units to this Skaven's roster. There's variations on units you know and love, alongside some totally new additions to spice things up. How do they all perform in combat? Let's take a look and find out. One thing to note is that the units in this mod are separated into their own clans or groups of clans. This means whilst the unit selection screen is totally horrifying to navigate, in-game you'll only have access to a normal sized roster at a time. I'm going to group units by clan to keep things easier to understand, so let's begin with clan Ferrik. The one legendary lord is Forge Master Ironskull, and he's a more defense focused Queek with more defense and armor, but less attack and weapon strength, and swaps the anti-infantry for anti-large. He doesn't have any mounts, but he can swap his weapon loadouts. Dual weapons drops his defense to gain more damage and a bonus versus infantry, and Iron Bulwark drops armor piercing and a chunk of attack for shield and increased defense. The Forged Lords are identical to a Grey Seer, but with a lot more armor and the Law of Metal with a couple of unique spells from the unique Skaven Law of Rust in the form of magic missiles and a Clan Rat summon. They can use a Screaming Bell mount, which gains them some armor piercing damage but loses overall weapon strength. For their heroes, we have the Forge Guard Captains, which are slightly buffed up chieftains, and the Ferrik Forge Binders, which are less armor piercing but otherwise improvements across the board from Warlock Engineers and the same magic as the Forge Lords. There are Ferrik variants of Clan Rats and Storm Vermin, and they all just gain a little bit more armor. We also have Great Weapons Storm Vermin. Iron Rats are a much tankier version of Sword and Shield Storm Vermin. Grenadiers have more range and missile damage than Globadiers. Rasketeers are very similar to Empire Handgunners. Gunpowder Rattling Guns increase their missile strength. Gunpowder Jezzails, again a small increase in missile strength. Same for the Cannon Shot Mortar. Armored Rat Ogres are a Rat Ogre with more armor, shockingly enough. The Dwarf Thing Shield Thrower is similar to a Dwarf Bolt Thrower, but with more missile strength. The Organ Gun has a little bit more missile strength than the Dwarf version. The Rat Snatchers are a moderately fast but high damage chariot with lots of charge bonus and some decent armor piercing range. Forge Guard are very elite endgame infantry units with high magical damage and decent defense. Gold Vermin are Plague Monks with a whole lot of armor. Cluster Mortars have much more explosive damage than the regular Globe Mortar. Line Breakers have a small unit size but are much more damaging Rat Ogres, and the Shield Thrower Battery seems to be the exact same as the regular Shield Thrower. Moving on to the Plague Clans, which includes Fester, Morbidius, Septic, Scrat, the Bubonic Court, Feesick, Gangrous, and Pestilence. Scarrick Spine Mangler has very slight stat decreases from Queek. He can ride a Bone Breaker, which gives him a massive boost to speed and damage whilst losing a little bit of armor and attack. Arch Pontifex Sitch is very slightly weaker than Skrulk and can ride a Bone Breaker Plague Altar, which is the same as what Scarrick gets, but now it comes with a charge boosting aura. Grizg Rotai is a little weaker than Queek and can ride a Giant Pox Rat, which has much more speed and charge bonus. Poxtooth Befouler of Sotek is a little weaker than Skrulk with these Skaven spells of Plague and a bunch of powerful abilities. He can ride a Cauldron of 1,000 Poxers, which is more or less the same as the Screaming Bell from the regular Skaven. Nurglitch is more or less a much less armoured Queek with access to magic, and can ride a Pox, which has more speed and charge bonus but slightly drops his melee stats. Rikzik Seepage is kinda like a weaker Ikit Claw with less armour and melee power alongside decent non-armour piercing range damage, but no magic, and he can ride a Cauldron of 1,000 Poxers. Exalted Imperator Zik Vilepot is a slightly more defense-focused Queek and can ride a Giant Pox Rat. The Plague Pontifex is a worse Nurglitch and can ride a Cauldron of 1,000 Poxers. The Plague Lords gain some more damage and armor over the Pontifex but have no spells and can ride a Giant Pox Rat. For heroes, we have the Festering Chanter, which is a weaker version of the Plague Pontifex, and the Stinking Thing, which is a weaker version of the Plague Lord. Puss Bags have less HP than Skaven Slaves, but gain the Aura of Pestilence to reduce the defense of nearby enemies. Flail Puss Bags drop defense to gain some attack, but really, look at the stat card, it matters not. Rotten Rodents are Clan Rats with more HP. Dual Weapons Rotten Rodents gain some charge bonus and bonus versus infantry. Pit Fighters are halfway between Shielded Speared Clan Rats and Eshin Triads. Pit Vermin are unshielded but otherwise improved Sword Storm Vermin. Sling Puss Bags are similar to the melee version but gain 1 missile strength over normal slings. The Frothing Wolf Rats come in both poison and normal variants and both gain frenzy. The Mad Rat Ogres gain immunity to psychology. Rat Spawns drop some weapon strength from regular Chaos Spawn but otherwise improved across the board. For Clan Gnaw, we have June Skulk Skreekblade, more or less the same as Queek in combat and can ride a Wyvern for tons of speed, charge bonus and damage. The Wind Speaker drop all armor to gain some slight melee improvements over Grey Seers and have a mix of all these Skaven laws of magic. The Overseers are faster but weaker than a Warlord with a number of summon abilities for the various captives of the roster. We have the Wild Speaker heroes, which are slightly weaker than the Wind Speakers, and the Beast Stalkers, which are slightly better than Wind Speakers in melee, but gain some decent non-armor piercing range damage. They have Savage Skaven Slave variants, which drop some melee stats to gain speed and the bait ability, causing nearby broken enemies to go on a rampage once they close the distance. Savage Clan Rat variants drop armor to gain speed and some one-use missiles to weaken their targets, plus the ambush ability granting them stalk and unspottable. Big Game Hunters gain a chunk of HP over these Savage Clan Rats alongside some improved defense, and the Provoke ability to reduce the defense of enemy large targets and cause them to rampage. Ambush Netters drop some armor piercing damage from Big Game Hunters to gain improvements to almost everything else, plus they have the Snare ability to slow enemies down. Boar Wranglers are much smaller unit size and are better suited for charging with their reduced defense. Dune Daggers have a slight step up from these Savage Clan Rats across the board. Pig Stickers are about as useless in melee as Dune Daggers, but have some high non-armor piercing damage, best suited versus large. The War Pigs are slower and have slightly worse melee stats than Wolf Rats, but a higher charge and armor piercing damage. Savage Orc Slaves are worse than Savage Orcs. Orc Slaves and Goblin Slaves are about the same as the Chaos Dwarf Labourer variants, but the Goblins have the bait ability. The Rat Swarm is pretty much the Skaven Slave version of Warhounds, aka extremely weak and will break in seconds. Captured Giant Wolves have more HP but worse melee and charge than the Wood Elf Giant Wolves from Dryka. They do pick up Howling Charge so can shatter enemies pretty quickly with the added terror. Giant Rats are smaller in number than the Swarm, but they now have some respectable stats for taking on back lines. Not quite as good as Wolf Rats, but still a viable early choice. Captured Blood Vultures are overall very similar to Crowmen from Cathay, though a little bit worse. Scorpions have more armor, but otherwise are slightly worse than Giant Rats. The captured Feral Manticore is the same as the Chaos Manticore, but actually drops the Rampage, so big win there. Giant Scorpions are a little bit worse than the Tomb Scorpion, the Feral Wyvern is the exact same as the Greenskin unit, and so is the captured Rock Lobber. The captured Spear Chuckers, however, drop some range to gain some damage over the Greenskin unit. For Clan Vrrtkin, we have Trickstab Gribnode. He has more range and ammo than Ikit, but otherwise weaker everywhere and has no spells. He does, however, have a number of powerful abilities to drastically increase damage. For his heroes, he has the Master Globadier, which is a little bit weaker than Trickstab across the board, but has access to the unique Skaven spells of Miasma, full of damage, augments, and hexes galore. The Vrrtkin Skaven Slave variants have more attack and the remote boom ability, which can be activated to explode them to deal damage and debuff nearby enemies. The Clan Rat variants are slightly worse than regular Clan Rats, but gain toxic residue imbued attacks. The Storm Vermin variants are slightly worse, but gain magical and poison wind attacks. Shock Rats are Plague Monks with slightly worse melee stats, but more armor and some single-use damage over time and debuffing missiles. The Vrrtkin Poison Wind Globadiers have less range and damage, but now have the Poison Wind effect on targets. The Death Glow Bombardiers, same story as before, but now it's the Death Wind effect. Doomflare and the Doom Wheel have less health but more damage. The Vrrtkin Rat Ogres are exactly the same as the regular Rat Ogres. The Hellpit Abomination is the same but no wounds, and instead has the Leaky Tank ability, dealing constant damage to nearby enemies. And the Globeclaw Catapult has more range and damage. For Clan Kreepus and Clan Treecherik, we have Miserycord of Mordheim, which is similar to Ikit but less melee power and more ranged, alongside with being a lot less tanky. He also has access to the unique Skaven spells of Mordheim. Gristle Twitch Slice is quite a bit worse than Deathmaster Snitch, but still a very strong Assassin Lord. The Eshin Sorcerer Lords are very slightly stronger in melee than Grey Seers, and of course have the Skaven spells of Stealth. We have a shielded Skaven Slave variant which has slightly higher defense and a shield. We have the Warp Guard, which are much tankier shielded Clan Rats, and Halberd Warp Guard drop melee stats to gain some armor piercing anti-large damage. Black Skaven have less armor and melee stats, but more damage and speed than Halberd Storm Vermin. Verminkin have better melee and missile strength, but less range and ammo than Slave Slingers. Warplock Pistols Night Runners drop some ammo to gain some range and armor piercing Warpstone Corruption imbued missiles. The Warplock Pistol Gutter Runners lose even more ammo to gain even more melee and ranged power. The Shadow Rat Ogres are faster and gain Vanguard deployment and Strider to be a little sneakier. From Clan Grudge, we have Wraithen, who is a weaker version of Skrulk, but comes with the lore of Slaanesh. He can ride an Exalted Seeker Chariot, which drops attack to gain a ton of speed, charge bonus, and damage. The Stibberite come in the Shadows and Slaanesh variants and are a little bit weaker than Wraithen. They can ride a Seeker Chariot, which is the same story as before, same improvements, but not quite as strong. The Ratanettes are quite similar to Plague Monks, but a little weaker, especially with low defense and only a little bit more resistance. The Throwing Darts Ratanettes are a little weaker in melee, but gain some low damage Soporific Musk imbued missiles. The Mirror Vermin drop some attack to gain defense over the Sword and Shield Storm Vermin. Alongside this, they have a number of powerful abilities to increase allied stats and decrease enemies. Slaaneshi Rattling Guns gain a decent chunk of missile strength. Noise Chanters are slightly improved Plague Monks with some armor-piercing damage and powerful abilities to heal allies and damage enemies. The Ratanet Chariot is a slightly weaker Seeker Chariot. From Clan Haematoma, we have Krethak Goretail, slightly worse melee stats but higher damage than Queek, also has a number of abilities to massively boost his stats. The War Ripper is just a little weaker than Krethrak, and the Skull Priest a little weaker again. He can ride a Chaos War Shrine which drops all hope of melee power, with the goal of making use of those passives to buff allies. The dual weapons Brass Fangs have more armor and charge bonus than Clan Rats but drop most other stats. The Great Weapons variants gain a little melee power back alongside armor piercing. The Great Weapons Blood Vermin drop the anti-large bonus for more flat damage and attack than Storm Vermin, and the Dual Weapons Blood Vermin drop some defense and armor piercing for more base anti-infantry damage. Wrathstorm Pyroclast have increased melee power over regular Warp 5 throwers. For some reason, the Ember Skull Bombardiers drop a lot of missile strength to gain flaming missiles, the Flesh Harvesters drop a ton of missile strength but gain a lot more ammo, and the Skin Flare Cavaliers are slightly worse than Skull Crushers of Khorne. From Clan Verms, we have Blight 10 Scratch. He has similar damage but worse defense than Tretch, and has a selection of powerful summon abilities. He can ride an Arachnarok Broodmother, which has some stat changes from the regular Arachnarok, but should perform about the same. The Swarm Leader is slightly stronger than Warlords in melee, but gains some medium ranged damage. They have a number of powerful summoning abilities to make use of all kinds of beasties. The Swarm Caller are about the same as a Plague Priest in melee, but have these Skaven spells of Vermin with lots of damage, debuffs, and summons. The Lamplighters drop a lot of stats from Clan Rat Spears, but gain speed and the Worm Oil Flask, softening enemies up for further fire damage. The Vermin Keepers are honestly worse than Lamplighters, but now have a couple of summons and some healing abilities, so are more of a utility pick than something for raw combat. Scuttlers are slightly worse in both melee and from a range than Gutter Runners, but have more ammo and the Snare Net ability to slow down enemies. Spider Silk Globe Scuttlers have more range but less ammo and damage than the regular Scuttlers. Worm Oil Slingers have much more range and ammo than Spider Silk, but only a small increase in damage and no firing on the move. The Under Empire Spider Riders drop a tiny bit of damage from the Greenskin Spider Riders, alongside their entrapping net to pin down enemies. The Giant Scorpions are just the same as Clan Gnaw. The Giant Spiders are a much smaller unit size and have large entities than the Wood Elf Spiders, which gains them a ton more HP and damage. The Giant Under Empire Bat is pretty much a defense-focused Great Eagle, so not great in the damage department, but useful for keeping backlines busy. The Spider Hatchlings are a little worse than the Greenskin unit. The Under Empire Scorpions have worse armor, but more defense than the Scorpions from Clan Gnaw. The Giant Rats, same as Clan Gnaw. The Under Empire Bats have more leadership than Vampire Bats, but are about the same in combat. The Under Empire Flies are a much smaller version of Rotflies, with significantly worse stats, making them much more similar to Fellbats, but somehow even weaker. The Rat Swarm is the same as Clan Gnaw, and the Arachnarok drops the ranged from the Greenskin Arachnarok, but gains it a little bit of a boost to melee stats. From Clan Skurvy, we have Sketch Half Dead, who is very similar to Tretch, but a little more attack and a good bit less defense. And the Pirate Commodore, which melee-wise is a touch worse than Ikit Claw, but from a range is much stronger, with tons of range and a very high damage, albeit quite focused. For heroes, we have the Skurvy Gunnery Warlock. Compared to the Gunnery Whites, they have much more ammo and armor piercing in melee, but less damage from range. Still, the abilities are the real power, with lots of explosive power and ammo replenishment. The Skurvy Snipers drop the armor from the Warlock to gain a lot more range and damage from that range, much more focused on its own damage and buffing ranged units than anything else. The Tide Squeaker is about the same in melee as a Plague Priest, but has the Lore of the Deep and can ride a Tide Engine, which is basically a Plague Furnace, so about the same as a Plague Priest once again. The Scurvy Crew Rat, which are Clan Rat variants, are the same as regular Clan Rats but undead, because yes, these are not just rats, they're zombie rats. We have the Scurvy Slave Bombers, which have a little less range damage than the Gunnery Mob variant. The Crew Rat Bombers have slight improvements across the board from the Slaves. Crew Rat Warp Muskets have slightly worse range damage than the Handgun Gunnery Mob, but not much better in melee. The Storm Vermin Warp Muskets are slight improvements across the board from the Crew Rats. The Deck Engineers have massive improvements across the board, but a tiny unit size and ammo pool, so tend to blow their load fast. The Deck Mortar is slightly better across the board than the Vampiric Mortar. The Warp Carronade is a bit better in melee, but worse from a range than the Vampiric Carronade. The Doom Rocket Launcher has a little bit more missile strength than the Hellstorm Rocket. The Deck Gun is a non-Chariot Luminac of Hysh with much improved missile stats, but the usual low mobility. Deck Runners are about the same as Death Runners. The Warp Fire Gunships have less range and ammo, but more missile strength than the Dwarven Gyrocopter. And the Warp Bomber has less ammo and missile strength, but more range than the Dwarven Gyro Bomber, with all the usual bombs. And then we have a couple of people that are left that don't really fit into any of these clans. Drib Bentblade is similar to Skrolk with more armor, piercing damage, and armor, but no spells, and he can ride a giant Pox Rat. Shiwan Storkscent is a stronger Master Assassin with some huge range damage. Rakshid Deathclaw is about the same, but even stronger from a range. Wastelord Viscis Bokis is similar to Gorich, but a little weaker and unbreakable. Nelrich the Supurator is another that's similar to Skrolk but slightly weaker and can ride a Cauldron of 1,000 Poxers. Shen Singe is a very slightly stronger Eshin Sorcerer Lord, and Rickrook Sliceblade is a slightly stronger Warlord. Of the heroes, Skulk Felpaw is an assassin with worse melee stats but more charge bonus, Spite is a slightly stronger chieftain that can ride a Bonebreaker, and Norglich Shun is a slightly stronger Vrrtkin Master Globadier. There's also a number of Regiments of Renown, but if I covered all of those in this video, it'll be an hour long and come out in March, so I'm going to cope with the excuse that I'm leaving something for you to discover for yourself. So for some closing thoughts on this mod pack, as it is, adds a truly massive number of units to the roster, and the skirmish menu is beyond overwhelming to sift through. Like, this was a nightmare to get made, I'm not gonna lie to you. However, the fact that almost all of them are exclusive to one or more clans means when you're playing with them in the campaign, you never really feel overwhelmed. Instead, you get a fresh experience every time you pick up a new one, and that's something I wish a lot of vanilla campaigns had a lot more of. Now sure, some of the variants only offer very slight changes, so use the units the exact same, but occasionally you'll get something that is truly unique. Again, Sketch Half Dead and Clan Skurvy get some of the most interesting new content with the addition of undead rats. If you've ever listened to the Old Grumblers podcast, you'll know that we all think undead and demonic is actually a huge debuff for anything, but it's unique, so at least it scores some points there. Plus, giving the Skaven even more weapons teams to play around with will never be a bad thing. I think as long as you pick your campaigns carefully to ensure you hop between playstyles and rosters, you can get a lot of mileage out of this mod pack and play a whole bunch of Skaven for a very long time. But that's all I have on the roster of the Skaven Clans mod. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, like, subscribe, and if you want more Warhammer 3 mod videos, then check out this one, all about the campaign side of the mod.